An alien revealed the start of the apocalypse. Not a mushroom cloud, not a plague, but a quiet dying of feeling, an extinction from the inside out. It appeared to Dr. Donald Rivera at 3:17 a.m. in a hospital parking lot, a moment carved from the kind of exhaustion that makes ordinary things look like props, the vending machine light, the damp smell of asphalt, his own breath steaming in the cold. He had saved a child that night and held a hand that went cold. He had stitched a stranger back together and watched another slip away. His hands still smelled of alcohol gel and antiseptic. His heart felt like a mechanical valve that kept time, but no rhythm. He smoked because smoking was an honest ritual, an act with consequences you could see. He watched the ember die between his fingers with the kind of interest a person reserves for things that are finite. He told himself he was thinking of sleep. He told himself he was thinking of paperwork. He didn't know he was trying to feel anything at all. From the dining room of his memory, a child's laugh flickered. Sarah, 12, with a crooked tooth and a backpack that declared she was unapologetically herself. He had promised court-ordered visits and kept them on a calendar he rarely looked at. The divorce had been clean enough legally and messy enough in everything else. He remembers an argument about a missed recital and a sentence he could never take back. "I can't do this right now." He had thought it true at the time. He had thought it survivable. The hospital had taught him to move fast, to triangulate vitals, to privatize grief as an efficiency. In the ER's hurry, empathy had been packaged. Triage, stabilize, refer. Emotions were inventory, important only insofar as they affected treatment. Years of moving through life on that conveyor created a kind of anesthesia. The coping mechanisms that kept him from snapping in trauma had calcified into permanent barriers. He called them professional. They called him competent. He called home and said nothing. He had nights like this often now, pockets of insomnia where images replayed and emotions did not. He had become fluent in neutral tones. He knew the exact pitches that signaled concern without committing to feeling. The world around him thinned to procedural clarity. When Sarah showed him a drawing of a bird that looked like it might fly away from the paper if he nodded hard enough, he smiled and said, "Awesome," because awesome was the right syllable to keep the connection short and safe. He was a man practicing a life of half-presence. If you are listening to this and a part of you recognizes that hollow feeling, if you find yourself watching scenes of pain and scrolling past with a flicker of emotion that dies before it lands, you are not alone. This numbness is not moral failure. It is a survival strategy worn thin. But survival strategies have limits. They become the problem they were meant to solve. If this story is reaching you in a way that stirs something, curiosity, alarm, relief, that is exactly why you should subscribe and turn on notifications. There are tools and steps ahead in this story you can try alongside Dr. Rivera, and this series will lay them out one by one. He was finishing his cigarette when the light changed. It wasn't a strobe or a siren. It was a presence that erased everything else. The vending machine, the steam, the hum of the hospital. The air around him became the sound of a hush, like the instant when a crowd realizes someone has told the truth. The thing that arrived had no face the way he would expect, and yet contact was immediate in a place deeper than sight. It spoke without sound, an impression that unspooled in images and emotions rather than language. The words, or the sense of them, came as a certainty in the part of him that still remembered campfires and the taste of a mother's soup. This is not the end brought by fire, the presence conveyed. It is the slow failure to feel. It is lost without noise. The thought lodged in him with the blunt force of grief. He was the archetype the being seemed to pick, a caregiver trained to regulate reaction, a man who had straightened himself so often that his jaw had become a brace. It did not tower like mythic invaders in the movies. It hovered like an exam, a mirror, and an invitation. The being's communication poured scenes into his mind, the past of a species that learned by touching someone else's sorrow, the economy of compassion woven around campfires, shared grief that taught children how to be human. For a moment, Donald smelled smoke and wet grass and heard voices in the dark trading stories that stitched strangers into kin. The vision of the campfire wasn't an idyllic fantasy, it was a compressed lesson. The being showed him hands passing meat to one another, hands scraping at stew, hands mending torn sleeves. Those hands were not efficient, they were generous, they practiced patience, they created memory. They were the muscles of empathy, and they were exercised constantly in societies where survival demanded cooperation. Then the vision jumped. The same hands were now on screens, thumbs flicking, pupils barely shifting. Faces in a feed moved past each other like traffic. A child, a refugee, a stranger dying across the world. Images streamed past in 10-second bursts with the same neutrality as a weather alert. The being pressed the contrast. The muscle that worked in shared danger had atrophied in a world where pain is broadcast and bounced along like a signal without a receiver. Empathy had become a spectator sport. This collapse begins invisibly, the presence said, not in words but in the feeling of hearing a clock slow. It begins as 1,000 small disconnections. It will end as an inability to care. Donald, inside his own head, heard a voice that was his and also not his. What does it mean to be unable to care? How do you go on breathing and not feel anything toward another person? He thought of his mourning with an elderly woman who had died alone, and of the nurse who refused to let him go into the corridor after. It would have been too messy. She had told him she had children at home. He thought of feelings he could no longer name without embarrassment. The being didn't condemn, it mapped. It wasn't prophecy in a sermon sense, it was an analysis given in images. The first set of causes unfolded like a series of slides, each anchored to a photograph of a small life moment. The being cataloged 5 persistent erosions of feeling, and each landed with the weight of a lived example. Technology as simulation. Donald watched a teenager in his vision scroll through a stream of suffering, pausing only for the briefest reaction, an emoji. A heart clicked as if it were currency. The being asked him to notice the posture, shoulders hunched, neck curved, eyes reflecting a rectangle. It showed him that when human experience is compressed into thumbnails and like counts, the sensation of connection becomes divorced from responsibility. You can like a child's picture of a storm and never be moved to step into the rain for someone. A nurse in a pediatric ward reappeared in his memory, face professional, voice steady. In the vision, she is forced to set aside the swell of an internal crack when a parent sobs. We cannot let ourselves go every time, an attending tells new interns. The being explained that institutions teach a kind of emotional triage. The brain learns to withhold to function, and over years this becomes habit turned into architecture. Procedure replaces presence. Donald saw the classroom where technicians are taught that their steadiness is their tool. It is true, the training is necessary, but what the being pressed was that when withholding becomes default, tenderness recedes like tide and does not return on its own. Pandemic trauma as a slow furnace. The presence unfolded montage after montage of locked doors and uneven Zoom boxes, the faces flattened by bandwidth, the funerals watched through a screen. A father who lost his cousin alone at home,
a teacher who stopped seeing the faces behind her mute icons, a community meeting that became a list of names on a spreadsheet. When distress lives inside without ritualized public grief, the pain calcifies. Unprocessed trauma becomes an internal deposit lodged behind the ribs. Donald felt his chest tighten as if something in him recognized the weight of all those unseen, unresolved losses. If you or someone you know is carrying heavy trauma and it feels overwhelming, flashbacks, a desire to escape, thoughts of harm, reach out to a mental health professional or emergency services. Trained professionals, trusted friends, and hotlines can provide immediate support. If you are in crisis now, contact your local emergency number or a crisis hotline.
You are not alone, and reaching out is not a sign of weakness but of courage. Productivity and the worship of efficiency. In the vision, a line of people moved through factory doors and office lobbies. Every time their internal life rose above a certain volume, it was clipped, labeled unproductive, and trimmed away. The being showed him an office manager applauding someone who turns in the most deliverables, but never noticing the one who stops coming to lunch. The ethos of constant output trains the heart to displace feeling with function. Even love is measured by how much it can produce. Donald recalled nights when he skipped his daughter's piano recital because a shift required overtime. A real hero shows up for work, he had told himself. The being did not say work was evil. It said over-reliance on performance makes people instruments rather than persons. Fear-driven religiosity. An image of a small service lit by candles slid into view. The congregation whispered about omens, futures, the final day. People clutching doctrine like a talisman that numbed the present. In Donald's memory, a Sunday when a visiting preacher warned that the world was ending suddenly and salvation was only for the properly fearful. The being showed how an obsession with disaster can turn spiritual life inward and away from the messy daily practice of mercy. When faith is reduced to fear, it shuts the heart to the ordinary acts that reclaim it. Each cause was not offered as a moral indictment of people, but as a pattern that over time reshapes nervous systems. The being mapped connection to biology. Muscles unused grow weak. Neural pathways atrophy if not exercised. It did not talk like a human scientist or a theologian. It spoke like an observer of living systems, revealing an ecology of feeling and the places where it was eroding. The alien's imagery was clinical and tender at once. It did not mock human coping mechanisms. It showed them paired with their costs. Donald felt a gentle tilt toward guilt and then relief, because knowing a mechanism is the first step to changing it. He had spent years telling himself that hardening was a necessary tool of survival. The being suggested it had become a hazard. The presence punctuated the catalog with small, impossible-to-ignore human shorts. A nurse forcefully holds a child's hand while giving bad news and then walks out into a stairwell, closes her eyes, and sobs alone, the emotion being treated like a private commodity because there is no allotted time for it in the schedule. A father at a video call hears his daughter's first steps and cannot cross an ocean to be with her. He leaves the computer open and goes to work to avoid the unmanageable tenderness. An intern signs an order and ticks an emotional box labeled stable because emotion takes time they cannot afford. These are the ways the heart learns to keep its doors shut. Donald's inner monologue hovered like a low drumbeat. I have done all of these things, he thought. I have closed. I have learned the language of competence. The being did not look at him with disappointment. It presented him with a line on a map and a scale that made a number visible on his chest. He flinched. The being spoke of thresholds in the language of pattern and possibility, not prophecy claiming cosmic authority. It showed a scale and images of cities, and in the vision a number became a warning. When roughly 60 to 65% of the population loses their capacity to feel, when empathy atrophies to that degree, systems begin to fail in ways that are not only social but logistical. Public institutions, economies, caregiving networks collapse because the invisible glue that makes them function is gone. The being placed a calendar under that number, a span that looked like years. In Donald's mind, it read as a 15-year arc across which the cumulative erosion, unless interrupted, would tip into irreversible breakdown. "I will not be your God," the presence impressed, translating into resonant mental imagery. "I show patterns. You choose." It made a point to be clear. These were pictures of possibility, not scripture or immutable law. The urgency was tactical. Act as if the deadline matters, because acting creates the conditions for change. Then the vision turned the lens on him. It measured and did not spare its assessment. The being projected a percentage on his chest like a clinical readout. 80%. In the vision, that percentage was a temperature on a screen. His personal level of numbness, his capacity to feel, now was 80% blunted. The being's communication was exact only in the tone of alarm, not in the absolute precision of any metric. "You have begun to die inside," the being conveyed, with a kind of sorrow that was almost human. "You have 3 to 5 years to alter the path before the barriers in you calcify beyond meaningful repair." That statement landed with a clarity that bypassed argument. It was both a diagnosis and a summons. The numbers were part of a picture the being offered, plausible, terrifying, contingent. Donald felt the cold weight of a timeline settle into the space beneath his ribs like a second heartbeat, keeping time against his panic. The 3 to 5 year window was not given as an immutable decree, but as a call to immediate strategy. This is the period when neural and relational systems remain plastic enough to respond. He wanted to argue. Numbers felt like speculation, and numbers were things he could map, contest, deny. He could cite variability, human resilience, miracles, the unknowable grace of random kindness. But something in the being's presentation was not invested in winning arguments. It wanted actions. It wanted practice. He imagined Sarah's face, every freckle and hair out of place, and the word later became unbearable. In his mind, he reached for 100 small apologies he had not given.
"I'm sorry," he practiced to himself, quieter than a whisper. "I wasn't there. I will try." The being did not demand that he switch professions or renounce his life. It laid out in silhouette that small, consistent practices could rebuild pathways, tiny repetitions that functioned like physical therapy for an atrophied muscle. It hinted at a list, but did not enumerate everything in the first exchange. It was a teaser and a plan. Practice, community, unmediated presence, deliberate vulnerability. He felt anger then, a defensive flare. Who gives an alien the right to tell a man who has saved children and bled for strangers that he is dying inside? He thought of the recent night when he stabilized a toddler and then walked home alone, the baby's mother gripping his sleeve with a gratitude that should have been luminous, and he only felt fatigue.
He knew he had failed at some intimacy. He had been working for a system that applauded life-saving competence but did not necessarily cultivate the person. The being's assessment stung because it was intimately accurate and lacked vindictiveness. In the vision, the being did not merely diagnose, it showed a small, clear practice, a pause. It demonstrated a 10-second stop after a shift when one would normally run to the car and the next task. Close your eyes, it suggested, in the softest possible pressure on his mind. Feel your hands. Attend to the temperature of your throat. Name aloud the one thing you witnessed without need of commentary. For someone trained to move away from feeling, this was radical. For someone who had lived a life of habitually metaphorical breath-holding, instructing the body to return to a simple check-in was like relearning an alphabet. Donald tried the exercise while the being still hovered in the parking lot where the fluorescent lights threw rectangles on the pavement. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, felt the ember of his cigarette finally cold between his fingers, felt the weight in his chest. He named one thing aloud, the little boy who coughed blood. The word hung. He heard the syllable in the air and didn't try to dress it up. For the first time in a long stretch, the grief that had been a thing he managed practically became a feeling he could hold for a moment. It did not undo the night. It did not fix the divorce. It made the edges of things slightly less blunt. The being's presentation was clinical and humane. It urged him to see how tiny acts aggregate. Small actions are not mere gestures. They are the scaffolding of society. He imagined, briefly, the worst-case image the being had shown in the first exchange, a city in 2040 where people moved functionally through days, children unstartled by pain, hospitals efficient but flat, art museums empty of tears. That future scene had the antiseptic quiet of a good morgue and the efficiency of an impeccable machine. It was beautiful in its sterility and monstrous in its consequence.
Anger and doubt and a sudden, peculiar hope, these things swirled inside him like weather. He was an ER doctor. He knew how to triage. He also knew how to tell the difference between a life that could be saved and one that could not. What he was feeling now was the mixture of a man who was trained to act and one who had forgotten how to be moved to action by small things. Before the being receded, because it did not stay long, and that was part of its logic, the being intervened and then let the human respond. It gave him a line of practical clarity that sounded like a prescription spoken through a translator who had compassion for human frailty. Begin with 10 seconds, the presence conveyed. Find one person you will practice with. Stop using mediation when you are with them. Speak vulnerability in small doses. He thought of his ex-wife and the way she had placed Sarah in his arms for the weekend when she had to take a late shift. He remembered the look Sarah gave when she saw a cicada on the porch last summer and kept wanting him to take the insect down from the windowsill instead of throwing it away. He had been too tired then to join the ritual of wonder. The memory made him nauseous in its ordinary cruelty. When Donald later sat at a kitchen table in the blurry aftermath of the encounter, he tried one of the microscripts that the being's imagery left in him. He said out loud the words he imagined the presence suggesting he might use with Sarah. "Hey, I missed your recital because of work. I'm sorry. Can you tell me what the best part was?" The words felt clumsy, unfamiliar in his mouth. The candidness was small but heavy. The being had not asked him to perform a grand confession. It had asked him for precise, accountable lines. That was one of the reasons the instrumentality of its message chillingly matched his medical training. It gave him a protocol to follow. He rehearsed another microscript for a scene he imagined happening the next shift, which he feared and also desired. A frightened child on a stretcher, eyes wide and hands small and grasping at a nurse's sleeve. The snippet he practiced was simple and human. "Hi, I'm Dr. Rivera. My job is to help your body and to be here with you. I'm going to hold your hand, okay?
If you want me to stop, just say so. He pictured the hands being held, not as a clinical step, but as a sacrament. He told himself these were not magical words, they were choices. The being receded as if it had always been a gust of weather. It did not demand that he transform overnight. It did not promise that the numbers were infallible. It laid out a possibility map and then left him with the sensation of being accountable to time. The world around him came back into focus, the humming vending machine, the sound of an ambulance in the distance. But the night no longer felt indifferent. It felt like a test. He went home and could not sleep.
He turned over the language the being had placed in him. Small actions are not mere gestures, it had said. He thought of the babies and the elderly and the office workers and the congregations he had glimpsed in the vision. He wondered how many of them had already hardened into patterns they'd accepted as virtues. He also felt, in a way that frightened him, that the being's urgency matched an intimate longing under the armor he had built. He wanted to be seen without losing his competence. He wanted to feel something and still be useful. He pictured, briefly and painfully, the long arc the being had sketched, 15 years to a potential tipping point, a society that could degrade into functional but inert systems, people living and none of it feeling like living. The being had not presented any of this as inevitable. It had presented it as avoidable if a critical mass of people recommitted to the small, daily work of feeling. Over the next morning, in the fluorescent rush of a new shift, he found himself pausing, not for 10 seconds, as the being had suggested, but for 30. He looked at a patient's parent and allowed himself to say, "I see you," and not label the emotion he saw or fix it into a diagnosis. He let the words be enough. An intern watched him, curious. The intern said nothing about it. Something in the air shifted. Later, when a young man arrived with deep cuts and an old story curled under his skin, someone who had been thinking of ending his life, the ER moved into crisis mode with monitors and method. Donald stabilized him and then, after the immediate danger passed, sat with him in a quiet room where machines hummed like steady insects. The man spoke of loneliness that felt like a disease, and exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Donald listened. "If you ever feel like you might harm yourself," he said, in a voice softer than the one he used to direct procedures, "please let someone know right now. We have help. We can call a counselor. We can find a number. You don't carry this alone." That moment was not a therapeutic intervention in the technical sense. It was a human crossing of a threshold. He did not tell the man what to feel. He only offered to share the load of the emotion. When a patient expresses suicidal thoughts or active ideation, it's important to involve trained professionals immediately. Call emergency services, contact crisis teams, and use hotlines if needed. You are not a failure for asking for help. If you are in immediate danger, contact local emergency services now. He had said that second sentence because the ER required that procedural safety net. He said it also because the being's vision had made him hyper-aware of the costs of isolation and of the difference it makes when a single person reaches back across the void.
In between cases that day, in the sterile lull when he updated charts and took sips of coffee that tasted like cardboard, he found himself hesitant but compelled to call Sarah's mother and ask for 2 hours that weekend. He had been avoiding the calls for months. The conversation was brief. There was a polite friction in the background. He could have let the moment pass. Instead, he offered the small, audible intention he had practiced with the being's voice. "I'd like to take Sarah to the park on Saturday. She misses me, and I know I miss her too."
The ring of finality in the sentence was not dramatic. It was a choice. You could say the alien's appearance was an allegory. You could say it was a shock to a man already on the edge who needed a nudge. You could say it was a narrative device that allowed the story to speak louder than it might have otherwise. All of those are true, and the being itself insisted on that nuance. It did not replace prayer, therapy, or community. It recommended practice and accountability. By the time the shift ended, the being's imagery had become an active thread in his thinking. He felt the pull, for the first time in a long while, to align his work with his life. He did not expect miracles. He did expect to try. He did not expect everything to change at once. He expected awkward practice sessions and failures and small recoveries like the one he had had by the vending machine, fragile but real. On his drive home, the city slept in an unsteady hush. He thought about the 20 people he had seen that day and tried to chart whether any of them might be part of the 60% the being had warned about. The massive, impossible arithmetic of a global condition felt too big for one man. He felt small, then less small in the same breath, because the being insisted that small actors could be strategic. 12% of caregivers changed by example could be the tipping mechanism toward resilience rather than collapse, or at least that was how the vision framed possibility. When he opened the front door, Sarah's drawings were plastered to the refrigerator with different magnets: a bird, a sun with too many rays, a family of stick figures with faces. He looked at them and felt a fragile surge of shame and warmth that made his throat tight. He realized that the video recordings of a world without feeling had not been an abstraction. They were a future he had the power to steer away from, beginning with tiny choices. He thought of calling his ex-wife and finding the right words to say to Sarah, whatever she might answer. He did not yet know what the being would ask of him next. It had shown the map and had given him the first step: a pause, a small admission, a willingness to practice vulnerability. He did not yet know whether his own internal wiring would respond, or whether the barriers inside him had already calcified beyond repair.
He did not yet know if 15 years was an active countdown or a parable meant to wake him up. What he did know, with a clarity the being had left like a residue, was that inertia would not save him or anyone else. The world did not need more apathy or more clever avoidance strategies. It needed people practicing care so that the habit of feeling could rebuild itself in the small transactions of ordinary life. That night he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single sentence: "Today I will stop once for 10 seconds and name what I saw." It was a sentence small enough to keep and large enough to start. He placed it beside his phone. He imagined practicing with Sarah. He imagined entering the next shift with a different attention. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, a man who had long been anesthetized felt, for the first time in a long stretch, the ache of a life worth more than getting by. The ache was not crushing. It was a pull toward a life he had once believed in, a life where hands met hands and stories were passed around and the sound of sobbing could be held rather than hidden. There would be more visions, more causes, more brutal clarity about what a future without feeling might look like. There would be a list of practices and many moments of failure and glimmers of recovery. For now, the being had left him with a map and a 10-second practice. He understood that the rest of the work would be slow and stubborn and communal. He also understood, in a way that made his fingers ache to move, that he could not simply return to his old neutral state and call it recovery. The being had given him a diagnosis. It had given him a number and a window. It had given him a first instruction. Outside on the street, the city slept.
Inside the kitchen, a father tried to find the opening line for a conversation with a daughter he loved but had been too afraid to feel around. He stood, picked up the phone, and dialed his ex-wife's number. His heart stuttered. He rehearsed the tiny script in his head. "I want to try something. Can we make Sunday half-day with Sarah? I want to try listening. I might be awkward. I'm sorry for the times I wasn't there." He did not know how she would respond. He did not know whether she would say yes. When the call connected and a familiar voice answered, he felt the presence of the being like a gentle nudge in his shoulder. He spoke, and the words were small and precise, the first real work of a man trying to unlearn the ways he had learned to survive. He spoke, and the words were small and precise, the first real work of a man trying to unlearn the ways he had learned to survive. The weekend arrived thin as paper. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat with a backpack full of colored pencils and a thermos that had been filled by her mother's routine, not his. He had rehearsed little phrases. He had practiced silence. He had decided to let space replace speech where appropriate.
The park smelled like wet earth and hot dogs. A dog barked somewhere behind a stand. He drove like a man who had been given instructions and was learning to trust them. At the park, he did not perform epiphany. He did not make grand declarations. He sat on a bench and watched her build a tower of twigs, listened to the way she narrated the growth of a make-believe bird, and occasionally asked his opinion in ways that required small, honest responses. When she pointed to a cicada shell and asked whether it was scary, he felt the old reflex to distance himself, to offer a neutral reassurance that kept him safe. Instead, he bent forward, let the question land, and said, "It looks like a brave little suit. Do you want to pick it up?" She grinned, the scaffolded trust of a child responding to the novelty of attention, and handed him the shell. The world did not rearrange in that instant. There was no cinematic reunion. There was a hand passed from small fingers to his own, and the faint, surprising sensation of warmth moving across the palm. Back at the hospital that evening, he kept the practice active. When a family sat with a son who had a lacerated face and fear like a live thing under their ribs, he did not immediately turn to the chart and checklist. He asked, "Who should I tell about him when this is over?" and then waited. The silence was heavy enough to be useful. The mother told him the names of relatives and the story of the boy's piano lessons. He made notes not only about allergies and vitals, but about the small human architecture that made life legible. He felt awkward. He felt alive. Over the coming weeks, the change was neither tidy nor heroic. It was a series of failures, small recoveries, slips back into old grooves, and then another attempt. The being's 10-second pause became a practiced habit. He would close his eyes at the end of a shift, count to 10, name what he had witnessed, and then, most days, call one person to offer something small. Sometimes he called Sarah's mother to ask if she needed an extra hour of childcare. Sometimes he texted an intern to say, "You did well today." Sometimes he simply placed his hand on the shoulder of a nurse and said, "I saw you." The phrases were small. They were not cures. They were repetitions. Word traveled, imperceptible as breathing. An intern who had watched Donald's pause that first morning began to emulate it, awkwardly at first, then with more ease. A seasoned nurse who had learned to bury grief found herself telling a colleague about a song she could not stop thinking of, and because the conversation was permitted, the grief softened at the edges. These were not dramatic conversions. They were micro-contagions, small behaviors that spread because people noticed the permission to be less efficient and more human. That was one of the being's core suggestions. Practice begets practice. As the months went by, the narrative of his life shifted to include deliberate exercises.
The being's list coalesced into 7 practices he would carry like a toolkit. He wrote them down on an old index card, pocket-sized and stained with coffee. Pause to feel, weekly unmediated time, process trauma, tech Sabbath, intentional vulnerability, humanizing encounters, join a reversal circle. Each item had a shape and a method. Each item was both simple and stubborn. Each item demanded small courage. The first practice, pause to feel. Definition: a 10 to 30-second bodily check-in that interrupts the automatic exit from emotion. Why it matters: repeated stops rebuild the neural habit of noticing feeling before habituated avoidance takes over. How to practice: at shift end or after an intense interaction, take 10 seconds. Close your eyes or soften your gaze. Name aloud one thing you saw. Check where you feel it physically: chest, throat, wrists, and breathe into that place. Common resistance: I don't have time, or feeling will make me weak. Response: time spent now reduces later overload. Feeling does not incapacitate your competence, it gives you calibrated presence. Demo script for a clinician: I need to take 10 seconds to check in. The kid with the cut, I'm saying his name aloud because I don't want it to slide away. Mateo, I saw him brave. That is enough for now. Vignette: Don tried this after a night of back-to-back codes. He closed his eyes in the on-call room, named the child who didn't make it, Lola, and felt a wetness that surprised him. He did not sob. He did not collapse. He sat there with the feeling like a fragile object, and afterward picked up his pen with steadier hands. The second practice, weekly unmediated time. Definition: deliberate scheduled time with another person that is face-to-face and screen-free. Why it matters: prolonged, unmediated attention exercises relational muscles not activated by digital exchange. How to practice: schedule one 90-minute window weekly with a friend, family member, or mentor. No phones, no recordings, no multitasking. Use this time to ask 3 questions. What happened this week? What touched you? What do you need? Common resistance: I can't find 90 minutes, or we can just text. Response: start with 30 minutes. Prove to yourself the difference. Sample script for beginning: do you have half an hour this week where we both put phones away? I'd like to hear about something that moved you. Vignette: Don arranged a coffee with a retired teacher named Maria from his block. They sat on a bench, rain pattering beyond the awning, and she told him about the way kids used to stay after class to tell stories. He listened and remembered the slow pleasure of being witnessed by another person. The third practice, process trauma through narrative and support. Definition: intentional storytelling in a safe context, often with guided prompts to offload unresolved experiences. Why it matters: naming and sequencing traumatic events allows the nervous system to process them rather than hold them as suspended charges. How to practice: write for 10 minutes daily about one memory you avoid. Share in a trusted group or professional setting at least monthly. Seek licensed therapists for ongoing or high-intensity trauma. Common resistance: I can't go back there, or I tried therapy and it didn't help. Response: choose small steps. Expand slowly. Try different modalities. Professional support can be matched to individual needs. Microscript for listeners: I want to tell you about something I carry. It happened in the ER last year when... Vignette: Donald wrote at night about a case that replayed, an elderly man whose family had arrived too late. Putting sequence to the night decreased the relentless looping in his mind.
He also attended a few therapy sessions where a clinician provided containment and strategies. He did not find them magical, but he found them stabilizing. If you are wrestling with severe trauma, flashbacks, or thoughts of harm, please contact a trained mental health professional or an emergency service. Immediate help exists, and you do not have to navigate this alone. The fourth practice, Tech Sabbath. Definition: a regular period, half day to full day, during which screens are off and attention is dedicated to embodied presence. Why it matters. Habitual screen exposure conditions quick, shallow responses to suffering and trains the brain for novelty rather than depth. How to practice. Pick 1 day a week or a block once every 3 days. Announce it to those who depend on you. Replace scrolling with a specific ritual: walking, cooking, listening to a human conversation. Common resistance. I need to be reachable, or work will pile up. Response: plan with buffers, share boundaries, start small, a 3-hour evening every week, and build capacity. Suggested script to communicate boundaries. From 6 to 9, I will be offline. If it's urgent, text urgent and call. Otherwise, I will respond tomorrow. Vignette. On a tech Sabbath, Donald and Sarah made pancakes without a screen and timed a Blue Jay's calls, a ritual that felt clumsy at first and then unexpectedly like reclaiming oxygen. The fifth practice, intentional vulnerability. Definition: brief, honest disclosures that invite reciprocal trust without oversharing. Why it matters. Vulnerability signals safety and builds relational depth. Practiced often, it lowers the barrier for others to show their messy humanity. How to practice. Start with a sentence like, "I had a hard night and I'm still thinking about," or "I'm worried I didn't show up the way I wanted to." Common resistance. "I'm supposed to be the strong one," or "I can't make others feel burdened." Response. Vulnerability framed in small units is not a burden. It is an offering of human reciprocity. Microscripts. With a colleague. "I almost left early tonight because I felt depleted."
I want to be better at staying present. Can you help me notice when I'm checking out? With a daughter, I missed your recital. I feel awful about that, and I'd like to hear what the best part was. Vignette. Donald told Sarah at bedtime, "I was thinking about your recital today, and I'm sorry I missed it. I want to know what made you smile that night." She beamed and told him in vivid detail. He listened without interruption, and his chest unclenched like a fist opening. The sixth practice, humanizing encounters. Definition: treating each person you meet as a whole story, not a problem to solve. Why it matters? Seeing patients, co-workers, strangers as full human beings preserves empathy in systems geared toward reduction. How to practice? Before you interact, take a breath and imagine their life beyond the immediate issue. Ask one question unrelated to the complaint. What's something that made you laugh this week? Common resistance: we have procedures to follow, or we need to be efficient. Response: caring need not undo competency. A single human question can coexist with technical excellence. Microscript for clinicians. Before we get started, what's one small thing that made you feel seen this week? Vignette. With a teenage patient who kept withdrawing, Donald asked about her favorite music. She talked, the team listened, the patient complied with care more willingly. Humanity greased the wheels of compliance. The seventh practice, join a reversal circle. Definition: a small group committed to practicing the above habits, meeting weekly for check-in, accountability, and reciprocal story sharing. Why it matters? Communal practice multiplies change and provides containment for the discomfort of growth. How to practice?
Assemble 4 to 8 people, select a facilitator, rotating is fine, commit to confidentiality, and meet for 60 to 90 minutes weekly. Common resistance, I don't have a group, or it will be awkward, or safety is a concern. Response, start with one trusted colleague or friend. Test the format, set clear confidentiality and listen rules. The blueprint for a first meeting, opening check-in, 3 minutes each, state a one-word mood. Brief grounding exercise, 2-minute guided pause. One person shares a practice attempt, 10 minutes, followed by reflective listening, 5 minutes. 4. Collective planning for the week, 10 minutes. 5. Closing gratitude, 2 minutes. Vignette, Donald organized a reversal circle with hospital staff and a neighbor teacher. They met in a church hall with coffee and muffins. The first meeting was awkward. By week 4, members were reporting that holding one another accountable kept them practicing the 10-second pause during hectic shifts. Each practice carried resistances and clarifications. People pushed back. I tried being vulnerable once and it backfired. Or, I don't have the energy to build a community.
The script trained them to answer with compassion and concrete next steps. Try smaller units. Share 10 seconds of feeling instead of a life story. Seek professional help when patterns of trauma or severe depression appear. Or begin with one person who seems receptive rather than attempting to mobilize an entire department. If you are dealing with active suicidal thoughts, self-harm, or overwhelming trauma, call your local emergency number or a crisis hotline immediately. Professional interventions are life-saving and appropriate. These practices are complementary, not substitutes for clinical care. As Donald committed to this regimen, resistance came from expected quarters. At work, an attending who had always praised his clinical detachment made a face when Donald hesitated to move on from a particularly traumatic case. "We don't have time for this," she said, more in exasperation than malice. Donald replied quietly but steadily, "I think we do have to take a moment. I can't keep carrying these like loose threads." He did not encounter immediate endorsement. He did, however, find a single ally, a pediatric nurse named June, who had long suspected that the system was fraying. Together, they gently introduced a weekly debrief, a 15-minute closed door where staff could name heavy cases in a contained way and commit one small practice the following week. In time, the debrief became a ritual that the unit expected, an institutional friction that allowed humanity to exist inside efficiency. Parallel to Donald's micro-revolutions, the being's image of 2040 continued to haunt him. Once, late at night in the break room, an image rushed in without the being present. He imagined an ER where families were efficient in their grief, where the sound of wailing had become rare, and where machines hummed like placid sea. That scene did not belong to any single person. It belonged to systems that had found ways to function without feeling. He sketched alternatives in his notebook, city blocks where people gathered weekly in kitchens to share stories, schools where emotional curriculum sat alongside math, professions that trained for competence and reclamation. He was alive to the contingency of these futures. They were not predestined. 3 months into the experiment, there were small, measurable differences he could describe without turning them into miracles. He no longer left Sarah's house feeling empty and mechanical. The visits were imperfect but consistent. At work, he noticed a shift in how interns approached cases. There was more curiosity about the person behind the vitals. The reversal circle had 6 regulars and 3 additional attendees who came intermittently. They did not save the world, but they saved each other from sliding further into habitual apathy. After an emotionally raw night, Donald came home and, instead of locking himself in, he wrote an email to a mentor describing what he felt. The mentor wrote back with a note that read simply, "I see you trying."
That note functioned like a small bridge. The alien, never elevated to deity within Donald's mind, reappeared once more, not to deliver edict, but to reveal a split screen of possible futures in greater detail. On one side was a city in 2040 of muted textures, museums showing technically perfect art that did not make anyone cry. Children taught precautionary scripts rather than curiosity. Healthcare that extended life but dulled tenderness. On the other side was a world where schools had a daily half-hour dedicated to story sharing. Public spaces featured elders passing down memories. Surgical teams debriefed in human ways after operations. The being offered no certainty. It offered the logic that habits compound. You are neither helpless nor omnipotent, it translated into his mind. Influence is not everywhere, but it is local and replicative. If certain threads are rewoven now, others will follow. Donald did not need to be told twice. He increased his intentionality around 3 specific levers: his relationship with Sarah, his influence among junior staff, and his role in the local community. He started to lead a small workshop called Presence Practice at the hospital, a 90-minute session that explained the 7 practices, included a 2-minute guided pause, and allowed for partner exercises. Attendance was uneven at first. Eventually, an exhausted social worker told Donald she left the session with a single commitment: "I will text one person each day who I think needs to be seen." She did it, and she reported back that her texts sparked responses, sometimes gratitude, sometimes calls for help, that created new connections. The narrative arc did not avoid setbacks. There were nights when Donald slipped back into old survival strategies. There were times Sarah asked a direct question about why he missed moments, and he flinched and answered with a neutral "work stuff." He noticed the pattern and apologized later, practicing the microscript. "I wasn't honest earlier. It was because I was tired, but that's not an excuse. I want to learn how to be consistent." She watched him try and seemed to understand that learning could be messy. About 6 months in, a dramatic case cracked his new steadying practices, a mass accident surge that taxed the ER beyond its seams. The unit moved into triage choreography, and old habits rose with the force of habit. After the shift, a group meeting devolved into practical logistics. The emotional processing was deferred. That night, Donald felt the entire old weight of suppression settling back. He woke in the morning with a sense of betrayal at himself. Instead of doubling down on shame, he called his reversal circle and said, "I failed at my practice last night. I need to name it."
"Can I take 5 minutes?" he spoke, raw and unpolished about the case and his after-hours avoidance. The group responded with grounded empathy. One member, a high school teacher, said, "We all have nights like that. The thing that matters is that you came back and told us." The containment transformed a relapse into renewed commitment. Part of the story that was easy to miss was that these practices were contagious across institutions. A school counselor who had attended one of Donald's hospital workshops began to integrate brief narrative exercises into classroom routines. A local church included a communal story segment after Sunday service, where 3 people shared a small thing that had hurt them that week and one thing that had healed them. None of these practices required doctrinal uniformity. They required space and courage. Then, at the 9-month mark, an event layered symbolism and real consequence. A little boy arrived with a fever and collapsed in a febrile seizure. The family was poor, exhausted, and terrified. The team did what they could clinically. The boy stabilized. Afterwards, in a quiet corridor, the mother burst into tears. Donald did not run protocols. He sat with her, placed his hand on her back, and said simply, "I don't know what will happen next, but you are not alone in this room." The mother looked at him and said, "No one has said that to me." For a moment, the sterile lights were irrelevant.
Human connection did the work protocols could not. The mother later came back to the unit with a small tin of cookies and left a note that read, "You saved our son, and you saw me." Those notes accumulated like small currency, proof that attention mattered. As the year turned, small networks multiplied across the city, teachers, clergy, healthcare workers, and neighbors trading micro-practices. The beings claimed that a modest percentage of engaged people could shift systems felt less speculative. It began to look like distributed resilience. Yet the shadow of the 15-year image persisted. Donald continued to imagine macro systems where a majority loss of feeling had thinned social capacity. He also started to mentor others on how to carry the practices beyond mere personal fixes. He taught junior clinicians to script responsive language in admissions. "Who can I call who loves you?" A small, standardized question that reclaimed relational architecture. He encouraged hospital administration to create a policy that allocated 15 minutes after certain high-impact cases for staff check-in. Administrative inertia resisted at first, citing productivity metrics. But incremental evidence, fewer burnout reports, slightly improved staff retention, built a pragmatic case. Human-centered practices began to be reframed as sustainable human resource management rather than purely sentimental indulgence. There were ethical and theological conversations that emerged naturally.
Some people asked whether the alien's visit was a spiritual experience, a morale story, or simply a hallucination of sleep-deprived minds. Donald accepted the ambiguity. He refused to make the being into doctrine. He also refused to deny the way the experience catalyzed behavior. The being's role in the story remained that of a messenger, not a metaphysical authority. For those with religious commitments, the practices fit alongside prayer, community, and sacramental rhythms. For those without such frameworks, the practices offered pragmatic pathways to reconnection. Alongside doing, he began to document. He wrote down scripts, failures, and clinical constraints. He created a small workbook to aid the reversal circle, check-in prompts, guided pause scripts, confidentiality guidelines, and templates for community meetings. That workbook became the seed of an e-book, practical, not perfunctory. He shared drafts with a handful of colleagues and the reversal circle. They tested a few exercises, minute-long interludes that got people to name gratitude in the middle of chaotic shifts, and the responses were quietly positive. People started to ask the practical question, what can someone do right now in the middle of their day to begin reversing numbness? Donald learned to answer with a 2-minute practice that anyone could try then and there. He wrote it down and repeated it aloud at every workshop. It begins as follows. Stop what you're doing or find a place to sit. Set a timer for 2 minutes if you can. Close your eyes or soften your gaze. Take 3 deliberate breaths. Bring to mind one specific person you encountered today, a barista, a coworker, a patient, a stranger. Name one concrete detail about them, the color of their coat, the thing they said, a laugh. Say silently or aloud, I saw you. Feel where that recognition lands in your body. If anything tight appears, breathe into it. Offer a real, simple wish for them. May you be safe today. Open your eyes. For 30 seconds, notice how your attention shifts. It was not magic. On a train platform, a commuter tried it and reported feeling oddly leveled, less scattered. In a pediatric ward, a doctor used it before beginning a shift and said she was more present during exams. The 2-minute practice became a portable scaffold. As the community around the practices grew, questions and objections naturally arrived. Some people asked, isn't this just self-help dressed in moral clothing? Others asked, what about systemic problems like poverty, policy, and power? Can tiny practices change structural issues?
Donald found the best responses were honest and practical. Tiny practices were not the whole solution. They were tactical interventions that made human networks more resilient. They created the conditions necessary for collective bargaining, for civic repair, and for the small acts that sustain political will.
He began to teach people how to pair inner practices with outward action, use the pause to notice the person who lacks representation, use the reversal circle to plan neighborhood drives, use intentional vulnerability to build alliances that push for policy change. Practices seeded strategies. There were also clinical critiques. Some argued that naming feelings without adequate professional support could re-traumatize people. Donald embraced that critique and made referral pathways explicit. Every reversal circle template included a list of local therapists, crisis hotlines, and procedures for escalation. If someone disclosed active self-harm or intent, the group agreed to pause, ensure safety, and involve professionals immediately. The practices were not a substitute for clinical care. They were an adjunct. The community blueprint evolved into something practical. To start a reversal circle, choose a meeting place that is private and stable. Invite 4 to 8 people and clarify the commitment level. Weekly meetings for a minimum of 8 sessions. Establish basic agreements, confidentiality, no unsolicited advice, time limits for sharing, and the expectation of reactional support. Adopt a simple agenda, a brief grounding, one person's focused story with reflective listening, and shared commitments. Include a safety clause. If someone discloses active harm, the facilitator assists in connecting them with emergency services or a professional. Over time, circles could rotate leadership and invite occasional guest experts, therapists, teachers, or elders to provide tools without turning the group into therapy. Donald emphasized that circles were moral laboratories where practice met accountability. The reversal circle format worked because it balanced structure with tenderness. People reported that the presence of a predictable ritual made vulnerability legible. It was not a one-off confession, but a repeated practice that normalized human fragility. At the year mark, the city held an informal conference, a cross-sector gathering of practitioners who had been practicing and adapting the 7 habits. Teachers presented case studies of classroom improvisations. A small hospital team described incorporating the 5-minute debrief after traumatic cases. A group of students explained a campus initiative that paired older adults with young people for weekly story swaps. The conference was modest and local, but to those who attended, it looked like an architecture of repair taking shape, brick by communal brick. Donald stood at the back of the room and listened. He thought about the being's original image, a slow apocalypse beginning with silence. He thought about the small network of humans who had said, "We will not let feeling erode without a fight." He did not hear triumphalism. He heard a steadying hum, practical people sharing practices and commitments. There were personal victories that mattered to him. One night, Sarah came home with a school essay that began, "When my dad sits with me, he listens like a lighthouse." The metaphor was not perfect, but neither was he. He cried reading it in the kitchen, not loudly, but with a chest-welling gratitude that surprised him. He texted it to his reversal circle with a shaky message, "This matters." They answered with small celebrations. The being's initial sternness had softened into a companionable reminder, keep practicing. A year and a half after the encounter, he stood in an auditorium at a small hospital-sponsored gathering and told the story of the being, not as proof of cosmic visitations, but as a catalytic narrative device that had pointed to a problem and a set of remedies. He spoke about the numbers the being had shown, reminding his audience that those were images in a vision, not empirical certainties. He warned against weaponizing the vision as prophecy. He insisted on humility. Nothing in the story substituted for science, community governance, or professional care.
What the story did, however, was make an urgent ethical demand: treat feeling as infrastructure and practice repair. He also asked the audience a hard question: what will you do this week to reverse numbness? Hands went up in small commitments. Start a tech Sabbath, hold a weekly story swap, implement a 15-minute debrief, invite a neighbor for tea without phones. These were discrete acts, but they multiplied when practiced by enough people. One of the most tangible signs of systemic adaptation came when a small primary care network piloted humanity huddles, 10-minute team check-ins at the end of busy clinic sessions. The pilot showed modest improvements in staff satisfaction. The network did not claim to cure structural inequities. It did claim to reduce immediate emotional burden and to create better patient relationships. That pragmatic evidence encouraged other departments to try similar interventions. Yet the story remained balanced by the awareness that not everyone could do everything. Frontline workers in understaffed clinics often lacked the bandwidth to implement new rituals. For them, even a single 2-minute pause was a luxury. Donald worked with administrators to carve small spaces, 2 chairs in a quiet corner, a lunchtime rotation where staff could sit with a peer, brief guided audio pauses available on the intranet. Small accommodations allowed practices to be flexible rather than idealized. The biggest obstacle was not resistance to practices per se, but the temptation to convert them into moral superiority. Some early adopters spoke in ways that felt judgmental toward those who had not yet embraced the practices. Donald cared for the politics of compassion. He taught that the ethics of these habits required gentleness toward people who were still protected by survival strategies.
He reminded reversal circles that scarcity breeds defensive behavior and that shaming undermined the very relational work they sought to do. In other words, humility and patience were themselves practices. As the story broadened, Donald and a small team prepared a practical guide, the ebook, intended to be both manual and companion. It contained the 7 practices with scripts, resistance handling, the community blueprint, sample agendas, and a list of professional resources. The guide was a tool, not a panacea. It included a strong note on professional support and explicit guidance for when to involve clinicians. It also included a map for small public interventions, story benches in parks, tell me a story signs in clinics, and community listening tables at farmers markets. These interventions were aimed at making public spaces relational again. Despite these hopeful movements, Donald knew the tug of systemic inertia. He continued to imagine the 2 2040 screens, sterile efficiency versus messy connection. He also imagined an intermediate landscape, a city that had incorporated many practices but still struggled with inequality. The task of building resilience required that personal practices dovetailed with public policy, workforce protections, digitally humane platforms, mental health funding. The practices he taught were levers, not whole solutions. On a winter morning, the being's voice returned as a light presence while Donald sat with his reversal circle. It did not speak in the theatrical sweep of prophecy. It offered a crisp observation. The end may be quiet, not explosive. The stake is the capacity to be moved. Preserve it. The line felt less like an external command and more like a distillation of what they had been doing together. They sat in the quiet and practiced a 2-minute pause, and together they tested the conversion of silence into attention. The final months of Donald's active experimental phase were as much about translation as practice, translating individual acts into institutional rituals. He consulted with a hospital's human resources team to prototype an onboarding module emphasizing relational competence. New staff learned not only how to insert IVs, but how to ask a simple question that humanized a patient.
He advised a school district on creating a weekly story hour where elders and children met. He worked with a local tech co-op to design soft notifications, digital nudges that encouraged tech rest rather than constant pings. None of these were silver bullets, but they were ways of nudging structures to support habits. There were painful reminders that cultures do not change by edict alone. A public relations misstep by a high-profile practitioner, someone who had used the practices as branding, led to backlash, and the movement had to recalibrate its message to avoid commodification.
Donald learned the importance of guardrails. Practices should not be monetized into moral capital. They should remain accessible and relational. Closer to him, a distressing test arrived when an old colleague called with a crisis. The colleague had been living with unprocessed grief and had recently been fired from a job. They confessed feelings of despair and passive ideation. Donald listened and activated the crisis plan. He validated, he asked direct safety questions, and he connected the colleague to immediate professional help. He did not try to be a therapist. He used the practices to create bearing room, then involved professionals. That night was a solemn reminder. The practices were partial interventions, and sometimes the right call was immediate professional involvement. He reflected on the way the reversal circles had a built-in safety net for referrals. His role was to ferry people from practice to care when needed. In the end, the story he told to others was not of a lone savior or an alien savant. It was the story of a web of small commitments that altered probabilities. He told it as a plea for practice. Act as if the fragile capacities of feeling are infrastructure, because within the narrative frame of the being's vision, that is what they function as. He asked people to trust that modest acts accumulate. When the time came to offer a final formal invitation at a public talk, he kept it simple and clear. He urged people to try the 2-minute practice today, to form a reversal circle of at least 3 people, and to download the practical guide that summarized the 7 practices. The guide would include community resources and links to professional support. He framed the beacon of the being's warning as a narrative device, a catalytic parable that had pushed him to experiment, engage, and teach, not as a replacement for faith or science. Before the talk ended, he read from a small page he had kept from the parking lot at 3:17 a.m. Small actions are not mere gestures. He let the line hang in the room like a bell. Then he offered one more simple directive. Take one small action today. Call someone. Sit with discomfort for 10 seconds. Put your phone away for dinner. He reminded the audience that these things are not glamorous. They are stubborn and slow work that redeploys attention into the shared world. At the close, he offered the final CTA. The ebook with the 7 practices, community blueprints, and professional resource lists was available in the pinned comment and the video description, along with links to join local reversal circles and schedule private consultations for organizations needing support. He did not pressure, he invited. He finished with the refrain that had carried him from the parking lot to the auditorium and back into hospital shifts. The start of the apocalypse may be found not in flames, but in silence. The remedy is not a single heroic act, but 1,000 small refusals to let feeling atrophy. The aliens' images had been stark. The human response was to be tender, stubborn, and communal. In the last moments before lights pulled back, he looked out across the room, faces ordinary and attentive, and thought of Sarah building towers of twigs in the park. He imagined a city in which children learned to notice,
Adults practiced vulnerability, and institutions found ways to sustain tenderness. He did not pretend it would be easy or fast. He did not claim certainty. He believed in practice. He walked out into the night, the city breathing around him, and for the first time since the parking lot, he felt that the long arc of repair might not be a lone miracle, but a multiplied human choice. He had less time than he once imagined. The image the being offered was not a fatalist countdown, but a clarifying deadline. Act as if the small windows matter. He would act that way. He had begun. He invited others to begin with him.